1864 through the early months of 1865 in World War I style trench warfare, where casualties are actually going up. The total number of men dying on both sides is accelerating here. Union attacks against trenches require even more Union casualties. Finally, the trenches were superseded. He got around them. General Lee begins now at the very end of the war. It's April 1865. Lee's troops are running away as fast as they can, trying to get across the Appalachians and join up with General Hood's forces in Tennessee. Now, I told you that Confederate soldiers never lost a battle because they didn't have rifles or bullets or artillery, because those were critical. But you know what's not as critical? Boots. The Confederates never did produce many boots. And why am I mentioning that?
Because they didn't have any boots left in the war.
And the Confederate and the Union Army that's chasing them, well booted. Is Lee going to get away?
No.
Guys without shoes are not going to get away with guys chasing them with shoes on. The Union Army caught General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse and forced him to surrender after really no battle at all. Appomattox isn't actually a battle, it's where the South surrendered. It's there where Robert E. Lee did the most heroic thing he ever did, and the most patriotic thing he ever did. He is just the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, of which the Confederacy has many generals. He is not even a supreme commander. The leader of the Confederacy is Jefferson Davis, and Jefferson Davis wants to keep fighting and turn it into a guerrilla war. So Robert E. Lee, he went over his head. He ordered the entire Confederate Army and all the Southerners to lay down their arms at that date, and everyone stopped fighting. And nobody respected Jefferson Davis. Everyone respected Robert E. Lee. The South just stopped. We accepted defeat, accepted occupation. We've lost the war. Whatever the North wants to do, they can do. Fighting is over. Okay. It would be many years before any of the Southerners even changed their mind and began organizing things like the KKK, which wasn't really very important back then anyway. They had accepted defeat. They'd been defeated, and they accepted it. So, just the last few things to say then. I did a really good job today. Too good, in fact. The casualties in the Civil War were horrendous. Let's just talk about killed and realize for every man killed, there were at least 2 wounded. The Union Army, of which there were 2 million men at the end, and then more men who'd already served before then. 1 in 6 Union soldiers were killed. That meant that more than 1 in 6 were wounded. That's an incredibly high rate. That's the Union Army, the side that won. The Confederate Army, 1 in 3 Confederate soldiers killed, more than 1 in 3 wounded. That gives you like about a 1 in 6 chance of coming out with all limbs intact and no bullets in your body. Very slim. Those Confederate soldiers who all shot 8 Yankees during the war, they all ended up shot. Just about every last one of them. Even the ones who survived, walking the entire way home with 1 leg. The war came to an end in April, the first week of April 1865, and then in the second week of April, that's when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. So that's the last thing we cover for today's class, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because it happens for racist reasons. I hope none of you think that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated because the South was angry that they'd lost the war. They knew they'd lost the war for a year, and we're moving on with it. What happened is, oh, the one I forgot about, my God, good, 10 minutes left and I can leave that, it all fits together then. We didn't talk about black people. That's why I'm 10 minutes short, and that's maybe 15 minutes. Freedom for the slaves happened not the way you think, unless you read the chapter. If you haven't yet, when are you going to? Hopefully this weekend. Okay? Because Lincoln entered the war wanting to preserve the Union. After all, 4 slave states had remained in the Union, and Lincoln allowed slave owners in those states as a reward for their loyalty to continue to be able to own their slaves, and they were able to own their slaves right to the last day of the war, when they had to free their slaves. Lincoln's policy towards slavery changed in stages, and so did the Congress's laws concerning slaves change in stages. Beginning of the war, Abraham Lincoln had a way of talking, a way of using homespun humor, And if you don't mind, I'm going to give you his full quotes. You're going to have to listen to the whole thing before you get angry or think he's saying one thing when he's not saying another, when he's saying another. Newspaper men are in the Oval Office, and they say, "What is your position on slavery and the war?" And he said, gentlemen, if I can preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, then I will do that. Now, if it turns out to be necessary in order to preserve the Union to free some of the slaves, but not all of them, I will do that also. And if it becomes necessary in order to win the war to free all the slaves, I will do that as well. That's pragmatism. He wants to win. Without slavery, the South is economically a hobble. So there is an economic argument there more than anything else. Also, a number of meetings he had with famous abolitionists and African Americans like, what's his name?
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass. Helped change his mind as well. In 1861, the Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, stating that any property that fell into the hands of the Union Army would be government property. So as Southerners' farms were occupied by the Union Army, the people lost possession of their farms. They lost their property and became homeless, refugees. Meanwhile, black slaves who lived on that property were flocking to the Union Army for freedom, but they didn't get it. What they became is slaves of the Union Army. Now, that's the position in 1861, before Shiloh and Antietam and Fredericksburg. Now, hundreds of thousands have been killed or wounded. People are coming home in boxes. A war just to preserve the Union isn't worth that much loss. It isn't worth it. It's not morally or ethically right to die, have that many people die just because one part of a country doesn't want to be part of another country anymore. That's not good enough. The war needs a moral and ethical reason to continue. As battlefield losses mounted, abolitionists' calls for freeing the slaves begin to gain merit in people's minds. That's right, that's why my husband died, why my father died, why my children or my son died, to free the slaves, to make this country a better place, to make this gives a moral and ethical reason to continue to fight until victory. Lincoln latches onto that idea. He comes up with an idea called the Emancipation Proclamation. He wants to emancipate the slaves. He wants to free the slaves. And halfway through 1862, he tells the cabinet he's got this idea, and they convince him to put that paper in the shelf and wait. Because if the United States was seen to be trying to free the Southerners' slaves while the North was still losing the war, it would be looked on as an act of desperation. A last-ditch effort by the North, who was obviously losing the war. Now they're talking about freeing the slaves. Lincoln needed to wait until the North had won a major battle. And so it was only after Antietam that he issued the Emancipation Proclamation late in 1862. And the Emancipation Proclamation also does not do what you think it does. The trick question. On January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, how many slaves were freed?
0.
Why not?
It's only in the South.
Because they couldn't know.
And we're part of the U.S.
No, it's what he said.
They only freed slaves in the South. Obviously, the Union didn't have control of the South.
And obviously, the Union don't have control of the South because the Union could not free any slaves in Confederate territory. They were in Confederate territory. It's an ultimatum. The Emancipation Proclamation was an ultimatum designed to maybe end the war. He gave the South 1 month to come back in the Union peacefully with their slaves, or after 1 month is over, the government is going to announce that that slavery is over. The slavery is illegal, and that when the war is over and your land has been confiscated, you will lose every single slave. To pressure them. But by this time, the South is not going to buckle, so they ignore it until the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. That means the federal government has made its decision. And so had the Congress with the Second Confiscation Act, which replaced the first. Second Confiscation Act, the Congress changes its mind and decides that runaway slaves that reach Union lines will be granted their freedom. Abolitionists like that, and so did racists, because every runaway slave reduces the war by a day, because the Southern economy runs on slave power. If the slaves all stop working or all run away, the plantations can't produce any cotton to buy any weapons with or anything else. It's also going to clog the Southerners are going to have to guard their slaves 24 hours a day, and men who are guarding slaves are not fighting on the battlefield like they should. Black people have lived in the North as well as the South throughout American history. Black people were living in Boston in colonial times as free human beings. As you might expect, free black men who were living in New York or Boston or Chicago were desperate to serve in a war to free fellow black people in the South. They wanted to serve, and they did serve. 1 in 10 of all Union soldiers were black men, and that's about as many black people as lived in the North. So they were proportional. At the beginning of the war, that they served like black people served in all wars before integration in segregated units. Blacks serving in black units with white officers. No black man was allowed to rise above the rank of sergeant during the Civil War. But they did receive the same uniforms and equal pay. You don't send anyone to combat with less pay than somebody else. Everybody gets the same pay. This would be the first time a black man got paid the same as a white man in American history. Okay. All right. At first, they only wanted to let the black guys serve in construction units and stay behind the line. But after Antietam and Gettysburg, there were enough dead white guys, they sent the black guys into the fight as well. And they died in just as large numbers, and very large numbers indeed. Okay. There. So, the war is over. Abraham Lincoln, assassinated by, yes, a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, who was a professional actor whose brother was the most famous actor in America. Who's the most famous actor in America today?
Brad Pitt.
Huh? Brad Pitt?
I don't know.
Maybe. Who else? Does anyone want to mention an actor more famous than Brad Pitt?
Tom Hanks.
Tom Cruise. Let's say because he's crazy. Tom Cruise's brother shoots President Obama. That'd be a doubly large story. Okay. It'd be even better if Tom Cruise does it. Well, not, because I expect it. He's nuts. But I think he voted for him. But maybe he got disappointed in him. Anyway,
Right.
Brooks didn't. The Southerners defeated John Wilkes Booth did that because as soon as the war was over, Lincoln came out and finally gave a speech honestly admitting to the American people that he thought that African Americans, black people, were equal human beings and should be granted at some point in the future equal rights, voting rights, civil rights with white Americans. It might take a long time, but he was in favor of it. That confirmed the racists had thought from the very beginning that's why Abraham Lincoln fought the war. And now racists exploded with anger and began conspiring. Within a week, there were 2 or 3 failed attempts on his life before the one that came along. Many of the failed attempts were conspiracies with large numbers of wealthy men involved. It's just that those conspiracies, Lincoln survived. He got assassinated by a lone gunman, but people were out to get him. So, you know, obviously the country survived this war, but the next chapter that we learn about in U.S. History 2 is going to be very interesting as well. Bringing this country back together again is going to be a difficult process, and it's not going to be successful. But anyway, we'll learn about that in U.S. History 2. I hope that some of you are willing to sign up for the horrifically early 7:30 class or the horribly late 8:40 class. It's almost as if Trump is trying to get rid of me. But if you don't, I understand. And enjoy your college career. I'll see you guys all on Tuesday. I will start passing out the exam at 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock? An hour early, no, a half hour late. At 2 o'clock. Let's pass about 5 minutes early for anyone who shows up, all right? And then you guys will have 2 hours at least.
Just same thing, Blue Book and Scantron.
Blue Book and Scantron, exact same format.
An additional Scantron for the exit exam?
And an additional scan. I will bring those Scantrons to the exit exam. Okay.
Just the miniature Scantron, or how many questions?
Yeah, 25 questions. No, I'll bring them. I'll bring the Scantron. That way, if they don't provide me free Scantrons, I don't have to give it to you. But they will. I'll say, look, right, this is your fortune, these kids to do this. Give me some Scantrons. They will.
Are you grading the Scantron yourself, or are you grading the book?
I have an answer. They provided me with an answer for the
You have
exit
to
exam.
bring one
The blue or
Scantron.
green?
Yes. Blue or green? Blue or green, it doesn't matter, because I'll be running them through the old-fashioned scan calculator by hand, not running a computer scanner over there. You know, the thing with the old, with the ink. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, great. And I gotta rush off to my next class.